Nature grows far more crops than people do. When Barbara and I want to know how to do something really well, we come and ask the experts. And in this case, the experts are all the natural systems that exist in undisturbed wild land.
The most important thing for a gardener to learn is how to create great soil. So we're here in the woods to study nature's own soil program.
The nicest thing about the natural systems is that nothing is wasted. There are trees up above here that drop their leaves, and the residues of one year become the raw materials for the next. And so the newer material is on top, and then as you go down, it's already decomposing and becoming part of the fertility of the soil.
And none of this ever gets disturbed. Nobody comes in with a rototiller, turns over the soil. Everything's doing just fine the way it is.
And that's because there are billions of organisms, earthworms, beneficial soil insects, and microorganisms that are working in here constantly, creating the structure, the aeration, and all the things that the roots in here need in order to grow well. In fact, a fertile soil is so alive that studies have shown that a mere teaspoonful contains at least 1 million active soil microorganisms.
How do we apply these lessons to our own garden? Let's go back and take a look.
Just like on the forest floor, organic matter is the fuel that powers this garden system.
Now you can see that this doesn't look much like the forest floor here. Here's a bare piece of ground where we just harvested something. The major difference between the forest and here is that the organic matter that's produced isn't allowed to slowly decompose back into the earth. We harvest and eat the vegetables. We take it away.
Now, we don't take everything away. There are many parts of the vegetables, like these old wilted pea vines or this old cabbage leaf, or even the remains of this mulch, that we can use to add back to the soil. But in the form they're in there, they're not quite ready to feed plants. They need to go through the compost heap.
The compost heap being a big pile of decomposing matter that we make use of. This is a bucket of our #1 grade A compost.
Beautiful stuff.
Now we're going to teach you A to Z about how to make your own fine compost.
But first off, let's use it. All you got to do is pick it up, spread it on the soil as much as you can make, and mix it in. Mix it in shallowly into the surface of the soil. You don't need to put it down deeply. All those insects we talked about, all the earthworms, soil insects, microorganisms, that's their work. They're going to put that in there and make the soil fertile. So the key to this is to remember the simple rule. Feed the soil, and the soil will feed the plants. Now there's one more soil food we need to talk about, and that's minerals.
Now one mineral is getting taken care of right here in these old clamshells that we've left in the soil. They're gradually releasing calcium into it. But if you come with us, we're going to show you some other ways of putting mineral nutrients back into your soil.
The trees that grow well in the forest are those whose mineral needs are best met by what that soil has to offer. What you want to do in the home garden is make sure you have covered the mineral needs of any plant you might want to grow.
Now, a minute ago, I talked about making sure calcium was in your soil by adding clam shells. But it may not be convenient for you to bring an awful lot of clams into your garden. There's a simpler way to do it. Just add lime. Now, you probably think of lime as an antidote to soil acidity. Well, it is, but it's also a great source of calcium and magnesium, both very important minerals for your soil. If your soil is very alkaline, of course, you don't want to add a lot of lime. Try using gypsum as a source of calcium instead.
Now, in most cases, the other mineral needs of your plants are taken care of by plenty of good compost. But there's a just-in-case here. And there are 2 soil amendments that Barbara and I use sort of as a garden insurance policy. They are both ground rock minerals, just like the limestone. This is phosphate rock, a good source of phosphorus, and this is green sand, a source of potassium and any other mineral. Now, these things may seem a little expensive at first, but when you put them on, they're good for about 4 years, and I only apply them once every 4 years. That's pretty economical.
Now, how do you know whether you're going to need any of these things? A good way to find out is to have a soil test done. It's very simple. You can go to your cooperative extension service or your land-grant university, and they'll give you a little plastic mailer, and you go around your property and take representative samples of your soil, put them in the bag, mail them off, and they'll send you back a computer printout that tells you about your soil.
Now, very often that computer printout will look like the report card you got when you flunked 3rd grade. But don't be too concerned about it. Just pay attention to what it says about the minerals that are missing. And very often, the university will give you a recommendation of what needs to be added to your soil in order to make up the missing nutrients. Be sure and ask them, in your case, for a recommendation for organic fertilizers.
Don't think of this as too scientific or complicated a process. It's an awful lot like making a great stew. If you're using organic materials, the more you put in, the better it's going to be.
Now, there's one more consideration, though. No matter how good you get it, how fertile you get your garden, if the soil is too compacted, it still won't work well. And we're going to deal with that next. There are two reasons why the soil in the forest doesn't become compacted. First, nobody walks on it. In order to duplicate that in the garden, we try and confine our foot traffic to the paths between the growing beds.
A lot of people think that we have raised beds in our garden, but actually all we have is trodden paths.
And the second reason is roots. The plants in the forest are perennials, that is, they're there year after year, and they have a much more extensive root system which opens and aerates the soil. The plants in your garden are mostly annuals, one-year plants, and don't have anywhere near the root system to do that job. And so we use a mechanical technique to make up for that. I'd call it soil aeration. You can do it with a garden fork. Just poke it into the ground, pull back on the handle, just lift and loosen. You're not turning the soil, you're just putting air in underneath. And if this works well for you and you like the technique or have a bigger garden, you might try another tool. This is called a broad fork, and it's designed specifically for this job. Push in, pull back, lift, and loosen. It's nice exercise and very effective.
When you're learning from nature, you start to think like a plant. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Pretend that the fingers on your hands are the roots of plants. Stick them into your soil, wiggle it around. Is it easy to do? If it is, the plant is going to like it too, and you have good soil for growing things.
And those are the secrets to soil fertility: organic matter, adequate minerals, and plenty of air for your plant's roots.
You've probably heard or read about nitrogen fixation, and I'm going to give you a close look at how this actually works. Now, the family of plants called the legumes, this includes peas, beans, and some very important cover crops such as clover and alfalfa. These have a special relationship with the bacteria that enables them to store nitrogen on nodules on their roots. Let's look at how this happens. I'm going to pull up the roots of these pea crop, which is finished growing anyway. I want you to look at these little white bumps on the roots. That's where the nitrogen is. So what I'm going to do is keep those roots in the soil. We're going to put the vines on the compost heap, but I'm going to cut them at ground level and leave that good nitrogen in the soil for the next crop.
Okay, folks, what if I told you I had a fantastic soil amendment here? The best thing that ever happened to your garden. Something that would take a heavy clay soil and lighten it up. Something that would take a light sandy soil and give body to it. Something that would make everything in your garden grow better than it ever did before. What would you pay for it? Well, I do have such a product, and it's free. It's called compost. What is compost? Well, remember the forest floor? Remember how all the residues of the natural system fall down and are slowly turned into a fertilizer for next year's growth? The same thing can happen in your garden. You take the residues of the flowers, the residues of the vegetables, put them in what's called a compost heap, and they turn into something like this. How does that happen, and how do you do it, and what are the ingredients? Come on with me, and we'll show you how. Hi, Barbara. Looks like you got plenty of stuff for the compost heap.
Oh yeah, our garden cleanup today gave us lots of good stuff for the compost heap. Yeah, I pulled out all those flowers that the frost got, and we got the corn stalks all pulled up, and I just got the bean vines in here, and pea vines, and tomato vines, and we're all set. Now, most of the stuff can just go right into the compost heap, just the way it is. Just pile it in there. No problem. We got some big heavy stuff here today. These corn stalks are not only too long to go in as is, they're very dense. They're not going to decompose very fast, and And all of these cabbage roots, Elliot, we're going to have to smash those up a bit.
Yep. One way of dealing with things that are hard to break down in the heap is to break up the fibers in there. The simplest way to do that, set them on a stump like this and just hit them with the back of the axe. And you notice that opens up the fibers in there. And if you open up the fibers, then the microorganisms that decompose it can get in there and break it down and you won't have any problem. The same with these corn stalks. The stalks might rot easily, but this end, the root, is really hard, and I can help that break down, again, by just a couple of blows with the axe to soften that up and let it break apart easier. If they're too long, I can just take this little machete and just quickly put it into smaller pieces that would decompose very easily. Now, many people might want to do that with a shredder. I suppose that's just as good, but this is a very, very functional way of doing it. The next thing, of course, is to get them into the compost heap.
When I'm making compost, I sometimes feel like I'm making a lasagna. The ingredients don't go in just any old way. They go in layers. Now, the stuff that I'm putting in right now, the tomato vines and the peas and the cabbage leaves and these kitchen scraps, these are all what I consider moist green ingredients. So we're making a layer of that. But after that, we're going to need a layer of brown dry ingredients to go on top. Elliot, do we have any brown and dry?
We sure do, Barbara.
Great.
The corn stalks that I just chopped up, they're dry brown ingredient. Maybe some of the straw from this pile here, or the beans that you had over there.
All right.
The reason you need a blend in a compost heap is for the same reason there's a blend on the forest floor. Different ingredients make the best compost in the long run, and also, if you have too much wet, moist, green ingredients in there, the heap will smell. If you have only dry brown ingredients, the heap will be too dry and it won't break down. But the combination of the two, aha, now we're cooking.
Yeah, think of the brown dry ingredients as the lasagna noodles, and then the moist green stuff that goes in between as the filling.
Absolutely. Now you can see from the pile of materials we have here that we're going to fill this heap up pretty quickly. This is a wonderful heap for the small yard, but if you like to make a lot of compost and have a lot of ingredients, you're going to need a larger area in which to put them. We're going to show you some other options for making compost on a larger scale. There are two things to look for when choosing a compost container. First, it wants to be strong enough to hold the ingredients, and second, it wants to let some air enter through the sides.
My dad had a nice simple system for making compost. He'd take a piece of snow fence like this and just make a circle out of it. It was easy to put together, and plenty of air got between these wooden slats. You can make this any size you want, but I would say that above about 6 feet in diameter, it gets a little unwieldy to reach into here when you're throwing ingredients in.
And for many people, maybe this is too high to reach in, so you might want something shorter. How about this wire? This is just plastic covered wire. It isn't as tall. You can cut pieces out of this, put them in a circle, and make your compost heap that way. But our favorite is to make it out of straw bales like this. It's certainly strong enough, and the bales are porous enough to let air enter. Now, it takes a year to make good compost, and so we have two heaps. One here that we're making, and one for the finished product.
And here it is. Oh, look at that great stuff. You can tell your compost is finished when it just looks like good, rich, fertile soil. You can't even distinguish the stuff that went into it before it broke down. Unless, of course, somebody's forgotten to chop up the old cabbage stems. There you go, Elliot.
Well, I guess we'll just have to put it back through the process again. One nice thing about the composting process is it's just that simple. Other than layering the ingredients in here in the order that we mentioned before, Barbara and I don't do any work. There are hundreds of billions of little microorganisms in here that are making it all happen. And all they require is a nice place to work and some warmth. Now, they take care of the warmth themselves. They give off heat in their process. The straw bales make it even better because they insulate the heap and keep it in there. And when I say heat, I mean some serious heat. It's about 35 degrees outside right now, but this thermometer inside the heap tells me that it's 108 degrees inside there. The bacteria are working. Now, once you start using compost to grow plants, whatever plants, whether it's your lawn or your flowers or your vegetables, it works so well, you're going to want more and more and more. And we make as much as we can. I wander out in the field next door and I cut old weeds. We layer them in there. Any ingredients we can find. In fact, another nice thing about the straw bale walls is that after a couple of years of acting as walls, the bales begin to decompose, and then they too become ingredients in the heap. When that happens, we just build another bale wall around the new heap. We'll show you how.
But first, Eliot, let's cover up this old one. We don't like rain to fall on the finished compost. It's not good for it. But, on the other hand, the new compost that we're working on needs to stay moist, so if it's a hot, dry spell in the middle of summer, go out and sprinkle it with a hose a little bit. That'll keep it cooking.
Right. Let's go make that heap.
Building the walls of a compost heap out of straw bales is just like building with big kids' building blocks.
In fact, it's just as much fun, sort of like building a fort. We've always found our children like to help out. Now, the heap we were working with before when we were building compost was made of 16 bales. 8 on the bottom layer, 8 on the top layer. This is a slightly smaller one, made of 12 bales, 6 on the bottom, 6 on the top.
You notice when we put these down, we're leaving a gap between bales. That's so more air can pass through, in addition to what's going through the straw itself.
Now, when you put the second layer on here, cross the bales over at the corners to lock them together, just the way you would if you were building a brick wall.
Now, we could just continue along with the second level of this heap, but on the other hand, sometimes it's easier just to leave the first one so that you can work in here a little more easily, and then when this is filled up, finish off with the second part.
So remember, however you make it, compost is the key. It's the magic ingredient that'll make everything in your garden grow better than you ever imagined.
Naturally.
One of my favorite tools is the traditional scythe. It's an old tool, as you can tell by the names. This was known as the snath, and these are the nibs. This is the Swiss or German style. What has come to America is the English style where the nibs are out front. I prefer this one. There's a sign on the wall of a friend's shed where he keeps his scythes, and it says, "Sharp me when you put me up, sharp me when you find me, and if I will not mow the grass, take me off and grind me." Well, that reminds me that it's important to keep this sharp. And I do that with a file, either a traditional metal file or a diamond file like this, just passing slowly down the blade at the right angle and on both sides. Be careful when you do it that you don't get what's called a mower's knuckle by getting your knuckle in the way of that. Now, traditionally, sharpening was done with a whetstone. It was held in a little water-filled canister like this that you stuck on your belt. And you took it out and then made strokes, quick strokes like this down the blade. Usually I favor traditional techniques, but in this case, I can keep it sharper with a file, and that's the way I do it. How do you use this tool? Let's go out to the buckwheat patch and I'll show you. There are two things to remember when using a scythe. First, it isn't a pendulum. If you lift it up like this, it's only cutting for a little bit when it's near the ground. You want to keep it near the ground the whole time and swing it in a smooth, circular motion, keep it low, then it works best. The other thing to remember is, don't make a frontal attack. Don't try and cut all those stems at once. You want to use it like an end around. You're just going to nibble away, bit by bit, smooth, it cuts with that flowing motion, and then it works really, really nicely. I'm going to take this buckwheat to the compost heap, and eventually it'll fertilize the garden, which makes this tool anything but a grim reaper.
What we've shown you in this show is that soil fertility isn't something you can just go out and buy in the store. We try to understand fertile soil as a living system that nature maintains.
The forest you saw at the start of the show goes on year after year because it is constantly renewing itself. We've always found our best success in the garden by paying close attention to nature's patterns. That is the real secret.
Until next time, goodbye and good gardening. These are delicious.
There's nothing more irresistible than backyard fruits.
Well, that goes double for me if it's raspberries and strawberries. I'm Barbara Damrosch.
And I'm Eliot Coleman, and if you'll stay with us for the next half hour, we'll give you tips on growing fruit in your backyard.
On gardening naturally.
This high bush blueberry planting is certainly being run as naturally as possible. Mother Nature is in charge. When these plants were put in about 30 to 40 years ago, they were kept weed-free for the first few years until the plants were well established. But since then, this is definitely a low-work system. And even though it might not be my style of operation, I certainly can't complain about the production.
Yes, when we put ours in, we put them in rows with mulch around them to keep down the grasses and the weeds. But boy, these sure have done fine on their own. Somebody must have given these a good start, Eliot.
Well, that's always the key with backyard fruits. You want to find the proper site for them, and you want to plant them right from the start. And we'll show you how we did that with ours this spring. The blueberry that you're going to plant may arrive looking like this. It's covered with plastic to keep the roots from drying out, and it has a tag on there to tell you what the variety is. Now, as with any plant, when you're working out of doors, especially if the sun is shining, you want to put it in a bucket of water while you're waiting to plant it so the roots won't dry out. Now, one of the first considerations with blueberries is they like an acid soil. Our soil here is naturally acid. I don't have to worry about that. But if you're in an area where that isn't true, you're going to want to get a soil acidifier from the people who sell you your blueberry plants to mix in the soil at the recommended rate in order to give blueberries the growing conditions that they like. The other things blueberries like, even though they're a small plant, is a good-sized hole. And as I dig this hole, I'm going to put this soil into this bucket here that I have half filled with peat moss. And there's a reason for that too. Peat moss is a good way to keep moisture in the soil and also to create acid conditions. And I'm going to mix these two together, just peat moss and soil in here as much as I can, in order to get a nice medium to put around the roots of this plant when I stick it in the ground. See that nice brown peat moss, how that really improves the soil here. Okay, I have that mixed together. I'm ready to plant. I'm going to take this, open up the roots somewhat that are trapped into that moss there, and set it in the hole in the right position. And then I'm going to dig handfuls of soil and peat moss out of my bucket and mix them in around the roots. Now, I haven't put any fertilizer in here, and that's because it's hard to fertilize blueberries without raising the pH, making the soil less acid. And so for the first few years, you don't need to do any of that. These are plants that, as long as they have an acid soil and plenty of moisture, will grow just fine. Shake the rest of this peat moss and soil around, get that in around the hole, and I have a well-planted blueberry bush. Now, being a moisture-loving plant, blueberries have shallow roots, and so you're not going to want to cultivate around here to keep weeds down, because if you do, you're going to be cutting their shallow roots. So the best way to deal with weeds in a blueberry patch is to do what we've done here and use a mulch. In this case, a mulch of chopped wood chips. Spread them around. You can also use sawdust. It's very effective. You can get that easier than this. And that will give you the ideal way to plant blueberries. And the final step is to prune off about 1/2 to 1/3 of the top growth. The reason you're doing that is because the newly transplanted roots can't quite support all of this yet. I'll take a pair of pruning shears and I'll cut to an out-facing bud so the growth will tend to go out and give this plant some form. And by the time I've done that, the job is finished and the blueberry is ready to grow. Now, planting raspberries is similar, but with a few differences. The difference with raspberries is in the soil preparation. For them, I want as fertile a soil as I can get. And so I have tilled under in here lime to raise the pH, phosphate rock, green sand, and alfalfa meal. the same amendments that I use to make any soil fertile. And I've also put on some compost. Tilled them in, created a nice fertile soil. Again, I'm going to dig a big hole because it's important when any plant that you give its roots plenty of space when you stick them in the ground. I have them in the bucket soaking. I'm going to take that out. That's a very nice raspberry plant. Put it in there to the proper depth, which is about an inch or two lower than it was in the nursery. And as I fill the soil in around it, I keep spreading and lifting the roots, so instead of being packed into the bottom, they all have plenty of space to grow, plenty of space to find nutrients in the soil to get this plant well established. There, that should about do it. Now, in order to provide plenty of good food for this plant in the future, I'm going to put a mulch of this spoiled hay around it. It could be any semi-decomposing material, half-finished compost or something, just so there's new plant food going down into the soil continuously as that breaks down. And then again, in order to keep weeds down, I'm going to cover that with a mulch of wood chips. The raspberry's in there, and it's ready to grow. Barbara and I are planting enough strawberries these days that we figured out a technique that's easier than the way we used to do it. And we used to dig a hole and carefully spread the plant roots out in all directions. Now that took a lot of time. Our new technique is a lot quicker. I take the spade and jam it into the ground where I want to plant and pull it toward me, and then I leave it up to Barbara.
It's a good two-person job. I'll take the strawberry plant, paying close attention to how deep I plant it in relation to the soil level. I want the soil to just cover where those roots start, but just below where the